Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. The college football playoff rankings for Week 11 just released. Alabama checking in at number 8 after a very impressive win against LSU, having wins against Tennessee and Ole Miss. And my thoughts on this, Alabama ain't the 8th best team in the country. They're a lot higher than that, and I get that loss against Texas at home Week 2 is looming large. But if you ask me, if you ask the College Football Playoff Committee, if you ask other college football fans, this team from Week 2 to what you're seeing right now is a completely different Alabama team. Jalen Milroe got benched after Week 2. Now we're talking about Jalen Milroe being a top 10 Heisman candidate. The vibe around this team completely different. Really excited to get into it. Before we do again, just want to say, one, thank you to you guys. There's been a ton of support for the fellas. If you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Again, can't thank you guys enough for all the support. Even better, would love to hear from you guys in the comment section how you're ranking this Alabama team. And Dill, without further ado, going to give you the T-box. Alabama coming in at how are you feeling here?
I mean, straight up eye test. I'm kind of with you. It's like this team.
Old school eye test.
It's hard to see a lot of teams beating this football team. And again, what Alabama's proved in terms of how much, like the road they've had to travel to get here, it's been as tough a schedule as I think you've seen in college football. I mean, even like A&M doesn't look like a good win. A&M's a tough team for a lot of these teams because, again, front seven is so good, and there's obviously talent on A&M. So, yeah, pure eye test, number 8 doesn't feel right. I mean, obviously, I don't think the committee can totally rank on eye test. There needs to be an element of undefeated Power 5 teams that stay up and so forth. But I'm looking, this Alabama team, how much better Milroe's gotten, how much more physical this offensive line's playing. Yeah, this probably isn't the 8th best team in the country.
That's where it is for me. Like, again, this Alabama team that you saw Week 2, Week 3 against USF, this is not the same Alabama team. You can tell Nick Saban extremely excited about the development of this team. You look on the offensive side of the ball. Again, Jalen Milroe, now a Heisman candidate instead of being a guy that might be the quarterback 2 on this team. The offensive line, meaningful progression from that unit. They're running the football a lot better. Jalen Milroe getting the passing attack going as well. And then you look at the defense. I don't know how many defenses you're taking than the Alabama Crimson Tide. And then you look at the resume and kind of getting to what needs to happen for Alabama to go and be in the college football playoffs. One, they already have 3 top 20 wins. The LSU Tigers, Ole Miss, who's in the top 10, Tennessee, who's in the top 15. And then secondly, if Alabama controls their own destiny and wins out, that is including a win in the SEC championship against the Georgia Bulldogs, who are the number 2 team in the country. If these chips fall, as we just talked about, I don't see a world where Alabama is not leapfrogging these teams and getting into a top 4 spot.
Well, and I get it. If Alabama wins out, there's no doubt in my mind they're the best team in the country.
I agree.
But, like, and hear me out for a sec, just purely by rankings, you can see a world where they're left out even having beat that Georgia team in the title by you're going to get one Michigan team or one Michigan-Ohio State. You're going to get Florida State if Florida State wins out. You're going to get a Pac-12. And if Texas wins out, I get it. I don't necessarily think Texas is the better team than Alabama right now. I don't think Florida State's the better team than Alabama right now. But just it'd be so unfair to either of those schools to bounce them.
Yep.
There is like that weird world that I think you can exist in.
Do you think the college football playoff committee learned from last year putting TCU in, or at least that thought looming where it's like, we know damn well TCU is not a top 4 team in the country, but they deserve it with their resume. We're going to throw them in there and they get absolutely shellacked in the national championship game.
Well, they had no choice last year for TCU because everyone else had 2 losses. It is tough when you have the 2 losses, but
it goes off that idea where, like, use your eyeballs, use your college football brain, and not just go off of like, yep, TCU only has 1 loss, got to throw them in there. Be like, yeah, Alabama smokes this TCU team. And so it's like, do you think the college football playoff committee is thinking, yeah, we might have learned our lesson by just going with these computer resumes as opposed to watch some football, you nerds, and pick the 4 best teams in college football?
Like the college football, like, fan in me wants to think so because that does give you the best football games, yes. Right? Alabama winning out and beating Georgia, they have to be in it.
I'd even want Georgia in there. I'd even want Georgia in there if Alabama wins out. Like, that's what I would, from a college football fan. I'm a Michigan fan. I'd want both those teams in there, because right now, if Alabama goes and beats Georgia, like I think they're 2 top 4 teams. Okay, that's some fan talk. Let's get into what needs to happen for Alabama for them to actually control their own destiny. And Dill, I think the team I'm looking at right here, it's going to be Florida State, because you see the college football playoff committee is not valuing the ACC. They got UNC hanging in there by a thread at the 24th team. They got Louisville as the 11th team. Outside of that, the ACC, not many legs to stand on. For me, Florida State needs to be perfect, and if they're not having a top 4 team. They're not a top 4 team, and when it's time to make this decision.
And frankly, to me, if Texas or Florida State loses, either of them are getting bounced. I don't care that Texas beat Alabama. If they lose a game, given the schedule they're going to play and given what the Big 12 is shaping out into, where Oklahoma doesn't necessarily look like a top-tier team. I wouldn't say anyone in that conference really does, aside from maybe Texas at times. But I think they're getting bounced. So honestly, to Alabama, if you get a loss from either of those teams, I think you're okay. But God, if those 2 teams win out, I don't think they're leaving out the Pac-12 and they're not leaving out the Big 10.
Well, I have a question for you. Would they leave out the Pac-12 if Washington runs the slate, the Oregon Ducks run the slate, and Oregon with that 1 loss to Washington on the road ends up beating Washington, and both of those teams have 1 loss? Oregon's the Pac-12 champ. What's going on with it? How do you value a 1-loss Oregon team with their revenge loss against Washington and a 1-loss Alabama team that won the SEC title?
I mean, they're saying that Oregon's better right now. It just, like, again, it goes into that, like, yeah, could they correct themselves, if you will?
But what does the resume look like once Alabama has a win over the number 2 team in the country, the Georgia Bulldogs?
I mean, honestly, with what's remaining, Oregon's going to have a decent resume too, because they're going to have hopefully a win over at USC if they beat them, and then another shot at Washington
and a win over Oregon State, who's a top 12 team.
You just, the fact that they left Oregon in above them right now, it feels like they can't really bounce them at this point. I don't think they can bounce either of the Pac-12 teams unless Washington loses and maybe beats Oregon, because they'll have a really bad loss on their slate.
It's going to be tough. And I think
it's tough because right now they're saying those 2 teams are better than Alabama.
Okay. And I feel that how I look at this, and I guess we'll close it out on this, because again, we're talking a lot of hypotheticals, but that's what the college football playoff era is right now.
That's what they've done to us now. They released these rankings. They get us all stirred up and arguing with each other. It's madness.
They got the boys' brains in a pretzel right now. I think at the end of the day, if Alabama wins out, you have Ohio State or Michigan dropping out. You're going to have a Pac-12 team go in, but you're going to have the Georgia Bulldogs drop out as well. And so for Alabama and Alabama fans, like, if you win out and you go beat Georgia in the SEC champion, you're the champion of the conference that's the best in the country, that a lot of people would argue, but SEC fans wouldn't. I think Alabama's going to be in there. And again,
I think it'll work itself out. It always kind of does. And if
it always does. Always does.
You're usually fine. Like, I really don't know that Texas or Florida State are going to win out at this point. They're both playing with fire relatively consistently. They both have a couple games that are very losable. I think if Florida State has to go play Louisville, that's not an easy game. Games in Texas, obviously, they've been playing tough with a bunch of teams.
And here's how I see it playing. And I think Alabama fans would probably agree. Like, there's always like a team or two that is arguing that they deserve to be in, but they really probably don't. And if Alabama wins an SEC title, they're going to be one of those teams that you look at the end of the year, and it's undeniable that they need to be represented in the college football playoffs. That's where I'm rocking right now. Would love to hear what you guys think in the comment section. Again, appreciate y'all rocking with the fellas. If you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.